BAMA, Georgia, SEC championship game as we all expected. We've got Gary Harris on the line from WVUA to talk about it. Gary, as mentioned off the top, this is what we expected and this is what we're getting, but maybe not necessarily the teams being in this condition coming into this game.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. And just to be honest, going forward at the top of the interview, I'm having a hard time finding a path for Alabama to win this game against Georgia, just in all honesty. Not that I don't think Alabama isn't a good team, because Alabama's a very good team. I mean, they went 11-1. They went 7-1 in the SEC West, which I think is the most competitive division. Forget conference, just division in all of college football. And so they have they've been really good. This is not last year's Alabama team, though. I think it's a remarkable coaching achievement by Nick Saban that this team is 11-1 with a lot of flaws, a lot of injuries, a lot of new faces. But when you look at this game, 2 years ago it was Notre Dame's year. 2010 it was Auburn's year. Alabama's had several of those seasons where it was just their year and their time. I go back to 2009 after Alabama had lost the year before to Florida in the SEC championship game. In the fourth quarter, they came back as a 5-point underdog and beat the number one ranked undefeated Gators with Tim Tebow and went on to win their first national championship under Nick Saban. It was their time. I think this is Georgia's time, Mark. I think this is the best football team that Kirby Smart has had. I think it's probably the best Georgia football team since maybe 1982. That team didn't win the national championship, but they were undefeated going into the Sugar Bowl. Of course, 1980, they won it. And Kirby's had a couple great teams. Mark Richt had a couple of great teams. But I think this is the best Georgia team since those Herschel Walker teams in the early 80s. And I think it's their time. I think they're a better football team. Defensively, I don't know. They're doing something, Mark, that I didn't think was possible in this day and age. With the offensive rules the way they are and the explosive offenses, they're putting up defensive numbers like we saw 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. Some of these great Alabama defenses. I mean, they're giving up under 7 points a game, 83 points total on the season, 69 of that actually just given up by the defense. So they're phenomenal. They're solid. They're healthier than Alabama. They've been able to dictate in every game they've played. It's been on their terms because they've been so much better. I think Alabama's only shot is to somehow get out in front, get it into the second half, and see if Georgia gets uncomfortable having to come from behind, which they have not had to do. But, that's just my feelings, and we'll get into more reasons why. But I think that it's very difficult to see Alabama winning this game, particularly with the injury situation. They've got one healthy scholarship running back, Trey Sanders, and he's coming off 2 years of major injuries. We don't know Brian Robinson Jr.'s status. Even if he plays, he's not going to be 100% healthy. So it's a banged-up Alabama team coming off a brutally tough 4 overtime game at Jordan-Hare Stadium against Auburn. And I think Georgia's just in the catbird seat here.
Yeah, Georgia, probably the two best teams they faced this year, not necessarily the two best offenses, but the two best teams, Clemson and Arkansas. If you watch those games beyond the statistics that you just cited that are amazing, if you doubled their points given up this year, they'd still lead the nation in points given up. But it's more than just, again, the effectiveness of the defense. It's like they don't even allow the other team to run the play half the time. They're blowing up in the backfield and not even allowing them to get the play started. So it's just amazing. It's just all this 5-star recruiting is now gelling and coming into. They've had really good teams, obviously, the last 5 years, but this is the one that's just hitting on all cylinders, especially on that side of the ball. Gary, with Alabama, we saw two different versions of what's wrong the last 2 weekends. Against Arkansas, Bryce Young is throwing for record yardage totals, but they can't get off the field defensively. And then this week, it's just a rock fight. And the resiliency of this team. And I think Nick Saban, that's why he was so emotional after the game. I think he really pulls for this team and really loves this team. But, man, they struggled against Auburn.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, they were running uphill the entire game. And a lot of that is because Auburn defensively played in a fashion that they had not played all season. And they were aggressive in blitz packages and didn't sit back. And maybe that's something they should have done more of. And some of it was self-inflicted errors by Alabama. They've had some of that this year, whether it's turnovers or short punts or can't get a 3rd and 1 or 4th and 1 or what have you. And they could never get in rhythm offensively in the game. But in that fourth quarter, when they had to have it, Bryce Young came alive. And I will say this, Mark, he is a special player. Bryce Young is a special talent. And I will go ahead and say on the record that Georgia's played 12 games. They have not faced a quarterback the caliber of Bryce Young. I don't even think close to Bryce Young. So Bryce Young is going to give Alabama a chance to win any game that they play because, as you said, he broke a 52-year-old record for passing yards in a single game against Arkansas and could have had more. Had some drops in that game, missed a receiver or two, 5 touchdowns. And even though Auburn held him in check, it wasn't just the last drive. Alabama had 222 yards of offense in that fourth quarter. They went up and down the field. Remember, they had a short field goal where Paul Tyson dropped the snap. They had to settle for another short field goal after they had a 1st and goal. And then that 97-yard drive was one for the ages. I mean, it's one of the greatest drives in college football history. When you consider the fact it's a minute 35 seconds, they've got no timeouts remaining in the game, and they go 97 yards, and they didn't do it on 2 or 3 plays. I mean, they matriculated the ball down the field, got out of bounds, got 3rd and 10s, 4th and 7s, and set that 28-yard touchdown up to a true freshman, Ja'Cory Brooks, who had as many catches on that drive, including the tying touchdown, as he'd had the entire season too. So Alabama offensively, even though they were not in sync in that game, Georgia has not faced an offense like Alabama's this season. And when Alabama's on, they can score. Now, they've had some issues in the offensive line. And, of course, against Auburn, losing Jamison Williams in the first half to a targeting penalty on a punt return was killer because he is the one wide receiver that can take the top off the defense. John Mechie's terrific, but he's more of a possession guy. So I think for Alabama, they can put that game against Auburn behind them quickly. They know they're better than that on offense. I do obviously worry about their ability to block up front and run the football, particularly if Brian Robinson Jr. isn't able to go. But throwing the football, you got a puncher's chance anytime Bryce Young is taking the snaps, Mark. And that is the one reason that I think Alabama people have some hope in this game is that Georgia has not seen a quarterback like Bryce Young, period, in the story.
And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people, including myself, did not turn that game off with 90 seconds left in the game because we know Nick Saban's track record and we're seeing it now week to week. His legacy obviously has been sealed for years and years and years. Bryce Young is building his legacy, and we saw maybe the most important bullet point of his young career come on that Saturday night drive. It was remarkable. It did not surprise me. I don't care what the FPI probability rate was on the winning percentage at that point. I felt as though, okay, this is Alabama. I got to see the last second go off the clock, especially in this game against Auburn, based on what the craziness we've seen in the last decade. That being said, the psychological advantage stays in the Alabama camp until proven wrong. We saw a monumental win by Michigan and Jim Harbaugh, so it can happen. But of course, Nick Saban has owned this rivalry against Georgia, even though most of the games have been excruciatingly close.
Yeah, 6-1 against them since he has been in Alabama. The only loss was in overtime in 2007, his very first season. So, yeah, he's had Georgia's number. We know that. But, again, you see teams that are – I always say, Mark, and we may have talked about this, when you're good enough long enough, eventually you're going to kick that door in. You know what I mean? Teams that flash every now and then have a remarkable season but aren't consistently good. It comes and it goes. Georgia has been consistently good since Kirby got there. I mean, they won 8 games his first year. In the last 5, they won double figures every year, played for a national championship, won a couple SEC titles. I mean, they're really good. And like with Michigan against Ohio State, Jim Harbaugh just kept pecking away. It wasn't like they had been bad. They just couldn't beat Ohio State. But this year was their time. It was their year. And they didn't just beat Ohio State. They handled them. I would not be surprised if Georgia wins this game by double digits. In fact, I'm going to predict Georgia to win it by 10. And not because Alabama's a bad team. Alabama's a very good team. But I just think Georgia's better. I think it's their time. They have been so close. Again, I go back to 2008. I was in Atlanta when Alabama lost in the fourth quarter to Tim Tebow in Florida that year. Tebow just ripped their hearts out there in the fourth quarter. But Alabama used that to fuel them. And the next year, even though Florida was number 1 and unbeaten, Alabama was number 2 and unbeaten. Alabama, it was their time. I think this is Georgia's time. I think they're going to be too much for Alabama. But Alabama won't lay down. Like you said, not with Nick Saban coaching and not with Bryce Young at quarterback and a defense that, let's be honest, they have had some issues this year. But they held Auburn to 158 or 9 yards in total in the game and really dominated in the second half. So that gives Alabama some hope too, because it's not like Georgia is the type of team that's just going to run away from you scoring points. Now, they're very good on offense. They're great at what they do. Stetson Bennett is exactly the kind of quarterback they need. That's why they haven't gone back to JT Daniels, because Stetson Bennett, I think, is the best quarterback for that team. And Kirby Smart knows that, regardless of what other people think. So it's not like Georgia's bad on offense, but they're not as explosive as some other offenses that Alabama's played against. So you just hope, if you're an Alabama supporter, that you can hang into the game, get Georgia in the second half, where maybe Stetson Bennett then has to throw the football. And they have to, they've dictated terms the entire year, playing out front, grinding you down, running the ball. If they get behind in the second half, how will they respond? We don't really know. So that's what you're hoping for if you're Alabama. But I just think Georgia's too much. I think it's their time again, and I think they'll cash in on Saturday.
And I think a lot of that evaluation of JT Daniels better than Stetson Bennett has more to do with recruiting ranking and people not being able to get that out of their mind. 5-star got to be right. Better than the 3-star.
Yeah,
so
bigger
he's
arm.
Be the starting quarterback.
Yeah.
So, Gary, if your prediction is correct, a 10-point Georgia win, that's going to open up all sorts of debate concerning this college football playoff ranking, because you can certainly take the side that, shoot, Alabama loses this game, we don't care. They're one of the 4 best teams in the country. 2 losses, be damned. That's the way it is. On the other side, it's they didn't earn it, not a conference champ. They lost 2 games. We have to discard them. And I think 10 points might be that sweet spot, because if they play a razor-close game, there's going to be a strong level of support, and rightfully so, that they should be in the playoff. If they get blown out, even though they might be one of the 4 best teams in the country, well, they got blown out. We don't need to see this game again in the playoff. Give somebody else a chance.
Yeah, a lot of it will depend, obviously, Mark, on how the other games play, the other conference championship games. Let's say this game goes as I think it's going to go. Let's say it's 27-17. Let's say it's very competitive, into the third or the fourth quarter, and Georgia seals it late and wins by 10. On the surface, you would think, well, Alabama's out. But let's say there is some chaos. Let's say Houston beats Cincinnati. Let's say Iowa beats Michigan. You know what I mean? Let's say that Oklahoma State gets beaten by Baylor. And then all of a sudden, if you've got a 2-loss Alabama team that won its division, that played Georgia into the fourth quarter, which not many teams have done. In fact, nobody's done it other than Clemson in the first game of the season in a defensive game. Then Alabama still might have a strong case as a 11-2 team to get into that college football playoff. Now, if Alabama loses, even if it's a tight margin, and Michigan wins and Cincinnati wins and Oklahoma State wins, I don't think Alabama's getting into the playoff. I just think there'll be too much resistance to a 2-loss team going ahead of those conference champion teams that have 1 loss, right? But if there is some chaos and Alabama plays a respectable game against Georgia, I certainly think you could make a case for Alabama as a 2-loss team in the playoff, even over Notre Dame, who has lost its coach and will not play in a game this weekend if they're sitting there with 1 loss. So it's possible for Alabama to get in the playoff, Mark, with 2 losses, but unlikely.
Gary Harris, WVUA there in Tuscaloosa. Gary, we always appreciate the conversations. This is always great to hear from you.
Thank you, Mark. I enjoy it. It's a great show, and thanks for letting me be a part of it.